Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Standing for Truth Ministries. My name is Donny Budinsky, and I am your host for this evening's special program. Here at Standing for Truth, we are committed to upholding the truth of biblical Christianity and equipping believers with powerful evidence for our faith. Tonight, it is my privilege to be joined by Dr. Heinz Lycklama, a PhD nuclear physicist, respected speaker, and bold defender of the truth. Dr. Lycklama will be presenting on one of the most important questions in science and faith, the major challenges to the theory of evolution. If you believe in common descent and you consider yourself an objective thinker, this program may just challenge your assumptions. You might walk away with your perspective completely changed after hearing tonight's presentation. So grab your Bibles, get ready to think critically, and join us as we dig into the evidence with Dr. Heinz Lycklama right here on Standing for Truth. Heinz, it's great to have you here, brother. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to this. We got a comprehensive one for the audience. I see people in the chat right now. So to let everybody know, we are going to be interactive after Dr. Lycklama's initial presentation. He's going to be covering a lot of material, which is what we like here on Standing for Truth. We like to be thorough. And so I'm excited for this. But before we get into the presentation, I do want to give my guest here, Heinz, a formal introduction for those especially who might be unfamiliar with who he is. Dr. Heinz Lycklama earned a bachelor's degree in engineering physics, 1965, and a PhD in experimental nuclear physics in 1969 from McMaster University in Canada. Over the years, he has worked in the telecom and software industries at Bell Telephone Labs and Interactive Systems Corporation. In 1992, he founded Open Systems Technology Associates, and since 2013, he has led the Apologetics Forum, equipping believers with scientific and biblical apologetics. Heinz continues to speak and give courses on creation versus evolution, Christian apologetics, and biblical worldview in the U.S., Canada, and overseas. I also have links to his website and other helpful resources that you can find in the live chat, as you can see here. Doki, I appreciate my faithful mod here, and also in the description box of this video. And so, Dr. Heinz, I'm thrilled to have you here. I'm looking forward to your presentation. So let's hand it to you. And whenever you're ready, if there's anything else you'd like to add, of course, feel free to do so. And then I can get your slides up. We can get into your presentation.
Okay. Well, thanks for the invitation here to speak on this topic of challenges to the theory of evolution. And I've been speaking on topics that are related to this for, well, probably more than 25 years at this time. And this one I've given a number of times at different venues, overseas as well as here. So the 5 challenges to the theory of evolution, as I speak on this, I think it's very important that we define our terms. So the first thing I'm going to do is go through that to define our terms. The first thing, there's different meanings to the term evolution, and we want to make sure that that is understood. Particularly, we want to understand the difference between microevolution and macroevolution. Chance, necessity, or law of nature, or design. Everything that we know can be, there's one cause for that. Either it can happen by chance, it happened by some natural law that determines that, or there is some design involved. And I also want to make the distinction between operational science and origin science. But the main part of the talk is on these 5 challenges to the theory of evolution. First of all, macroevolution. And of course, we'll define our terms, but that actually has never been observed. Second, there are no credible transitional fossils that would provide evidence for evolution. Third, life cannot and did not originate from non-life by chance. We have no record of that, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Fourth, the evolution violates the second law of thermodynamics. So, and then the fifth one, after all this summary, we'll conclude that, well, evolution is really just a theory. It has not been proven. And then draw some conclusions. So first of all, it's very important to know what we mean by the term evolution. And there are actually, people use the word evolution in 5 different ways. Okay, and I'm going to step through those. Number 1, artificial selection. And you've heard about that before. I mean, we can select the best of breed in plants or animals and obtain a superior plant or animal because of that. But there's a limit to what we can do in artificial selection. Second, sometimes people say, well, evolution is all about change. But that's not what we mean, because people use the word evolution in many different ways. If you look at the coastline with waves breaking up on the sand there, you'll see those are things that happen by chance, and tides may have something to do with that too. It moves the coastline back and forth, so it's changing. Cars designed, they change over the years, but that's not the kind of change we're talking about. And then we come to the term microevolution. And what we mean by that really is adaptation. In other words, small variations within prescribed limits of complexity. And we sometimes refer to that as adaptation to the environment. Okay, and that's probably a better way to think of it than as microevolution, because if you use the term microevolution, we think, well, what's the difference between microevolution and macroevolution? So you may remember that if you've studied evolution, it talks about mutations and natural selection, and we'll say Darwin says that the finch beaks, for example, they change size depending on the environment. And but that's not the macroevolution. This is microevolution, because you'll see as those beaks change size, they're still finches. Okay, so it hasn't gone to another different kind of bird. So then we come to the term macroevolution. Well, this is sometimes referred to as particles to people, or goo to you, as some would say. But this is going from non-life and going into life, and then evolving to more complexity. And that's what we refer to as macroevolution. And then we come to number 5, molecular evolution, and that is impossible. And that talks about the origin of life, because life requires a mutating replicator. Okay, and there is no way to obtain that from non-life through natural processes into a mutating replicator, the start of life. Okay, so when we talk about the term evolution, I'm going to use that as Darwinian evolution, or Darwinian, neo-Darwinian evolution. That's what we mean by that, and that is number 4. Okay. So then, just to summarize and make sure we are on the same page as far as what we mean by evolution or Darwinian evolution, and the number of ways we look at that, it involves evolution works through random chance mutation that cause changes or variation in a population of organisms. These different organisms then compete to survive and reproduce, and those which are best suited to survive and reproduce do so and tend to leave the most offspring. This is called natural selection. And that's what Darwin refers to that. Over time, if some organisms survive and reproduce more than others, a species will evolve. Okay, that's the assumption of Darwinian evolution. So the claims of that you can summarize by saying all organisms are related through common ancestry. That's very key to the definition of Darwinian evolution. Second, all organisms arose through the process of mutations and natural selection. That is really the evolution that we're talking about. And then all organisms arose and persist because of the random chance processes of nature. Okay, that's what Darwinian evolution is all about. That's what he defined in The Origin of Species. And the big picture is, the origin of the universe, origin of Earth, primordial soup, and then from there, RNA, protein, DNA, cells, bacteria, primitive cells, fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, and lower primates, monkeys, early apes, hominids, and then finally humans. Okay, that's what we mean by Darwinian evolution. So some more terms, then to summarize, microevolution is comparatively minor changes within a living organism that allows it to adapt to its environment. Macroevolution, then in summary, living things, species, are related to one another through common descent from early life forms that differ from them. That's descent with modification. And you can see kind of a big picture tree here. That does that. So the evolution mechanisms, what are the mechanisms that are assumed to be part of evolution? Well, natural selection, you've heard that term. Selection of genes, mutations for survival of the fittest. Living organisms have genes. And sometimes in the reproduction of the living organism, their mutations come about. And so these are used or picked up through natural selection. And so natural selection is an observable process that supposedly underlies the mechanism of unobservable molecules to man evolution. And this requires a directional change. In other words, starting from a simple living cell, for example, it goes to more and more complexity. So that's what we mean by natural selection. Mutations, how do they come about? Well, they're the result of random copying errors or changing in the genes or the DNA. And these are supposedly the source of new traits for evolution. And the genetic information, over time, mutations, they don't add information, they take information away from that living organism. But this requires predominantly beneficial mutations. If your mutations are bad, of course, you don't want to duplicate that. You don't want to reproduce that. The only way to get more complex living organisms is to have beneficial mutations. And so we look at these trees here, natural selection. Okay, the Darwin's tree is on the right here. Its morphology, it starts from a common ancestor and then branches out into different kinds of living organisms. So, and on the creation side, according to the Bible, every living organism is created, every kind of living organism is created by God, as documented in chapter 1 of Genesis. And so you have different starts, different kinds of living organisms. We talk about cats, dogs, horses, chickens, different plants. They all have a different starting point. So what can selection do? It can only select from information that already exists. So natural selection can decrease genetic information, because if you get a bad mutation, you're going to lose information. It allows organisms to survive better in a given environment, and it can act as a selector. And this supports the creation's what we call the orchard of life, as you can see here. What natural selection cannot do, there is no way to increase or generate new genetic information. It cannot allow organisms to evolve from molecules to man. And it acts as a originator. It cannot act as an originator of new information. And it can't support the evolutionary tree of life, because where does the new information come from? Okay, so those are the big differences that we need to keep in mind as we move forward here. In general, I like to use this picture here of the 4 presidents in the U.S. on Mount Rushmore, because when you think about it, everything happens for a cause. There are causes. If you look at this here, you ask the question, did this happen by chance? You get the faces of 4 presidents in the rock there. Did they happen by chance? Was there some law of nature? It's the way the rain came on the rock, it carved out these faces. That's law of nature or necessity. And the third option is design. And I think you will agree, this is design. Artist created the design, and then others cut the rock so they show the faces of these 4 presidents. So we keep that in mind. We ask the question, as we look at this here, what caused this? Was it by chance? Was it by a law of nature? Or was it design? And by a law of nature, I mean something like the law of gravity. If I step on a table and put 1 foot over it, and which way am I going to go? I'm always going down. And that's because the law of gravity forces me to go down. Okay, another way to look at examples of chance, necessity, or design. I've got 4 different pictures here. And these first 2 are pictures of scratches on a cave wall. So the first one to the upper left here, you can see some scratches in the rocks here. And you'll say, well, maybe some rocks were falling down and left these scratches, possibly. But if you look at the one below that, you can see the pictures of animals, of horses, of pigs, and other animals clearly drawn on the cave wall. Did that happen by chance? No, that happened by design, because somebody carved those characters on that cave wall. So then we come to the human genome. As you know, we have 3 billion base pairs in our genome, and it's very, very complex. So you ask the question, how did that come about? Did that happen by chance, necessity, or design? And then you look at one cell, for example, we have about 20 trillion, sometimes people say 50 trillion different cells. And you can look at a picture of one of those cells, and it's obviously very, very complex. How did that happen by chance? You'd agree the probability of that happening by chance is 0. Such a small fraction that it just is not going to happen. So this helps us to determine how things happen. So how did the evolutionists respond to that? Well, here's Dr. Todd, who is a professor at Kansas State University. He obviously believes in evolution. He says, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. Okay, there's some supernatural activity there. Second, you know this fellow here, Dr. Dawkins, Richard Dawkins from Oxford University. He's obviously an atheist, a biologist, and what he says, biology is a study of complicated things that have the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Okay, well, if you ask the question, perhaps it was designed. But and this is, to me, this is a surprise that Francis Crick, one of the co-discoverers of DNA back in 1953, he says, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Very, very different kind of a statement, not what you expect. So first of all, let's make sure we understand what science is. Well, science is a search for truth. And when we talk about operational science, we mean the scientific method. Okay, we can postulate a theory. Okay, we can say, well, we think it happened this way. We'll make observations and draw conclusions. Did it happen that way or did it not? So you can change the parameters of your experiment and then try a modified theory and go round and round. That's what we call the scientific method. But then you also have to consider origin science, because when you look at the possibility of evolution or the possibility of creation, obviously we weren't there. So how do you solve something like that? How do you come up with the answer to what or who caused that? Well, if you're trying to solve a crime, for example, think of it this way. There is forensic evidence that we can look at. And you in the case of murder, you can find the criminal's fingerprints and other evidence and come to a conclusion, because you didn't see it, but you want to know who did that. And we weren't there at the beginning. We weren't there. If this universe came to be through creation, we weren't there. If it came here through evolution, we weren't there. So then we ask the question of which model best fits the observed facts. So second on science is the search for truth. And I think you're aware of these terms that we use. Starting with hypothesis, we have something, we come up with a theory that seems to explain some of the facts, but not all of them. And then we go to, well, let's go, if we have more facts that are explained, we go to a theory. But a theory has to be testable. In other words, you have to be able to test your theory, and you have to be able to run the experiment again. So it must be testable. It could either be falsifiable, and it also has, if it's true, it has to be verifiable. So it's based on empirical and repeatable findings. And the law, well, there's no known exception. Like law of gravity, we know of any exception to that. And then a fact proven to be true. Now, when you come to creation or evolution, I would say we have a model. Okay, it's a simplified representation of reality. And so both of evolution and creation, we consider that models. And so all we can do is look at the evidence left behind and see what is the most likely answer to a question. So the models of origin, we can neither observe nor repeat origins. Origin theories cannot be tested or proven because we can't go back in time. We have two models for origins, creation and evolution. Models can be compared as to their respective capacities for correlating observable data. So evolutionists regard evolution as a proven fact. Okay, I would say they believe that evolution is science and that creationism is religion. Now, evolutionists, however, are unable to prove evolution. And then we have thousands of scientists like myself who do believe in creation because we have the much more evidence for creation than we do for evolution. So what can we test? What can we prove with science? Well, we can test scientifically these things. We can look at observable processes that are repeatable and using the scientific method to come to some truth. We can look at trends and tendencies in nature and draw conclusions there. And in some cases, we can only draw conclusions because these processes back in time left some evidence. However, we cannot test scientifically identity, motivation of who, what, or whoever brought this to be, the universe and life into existence. We can look at historical events, but we cannot test historical events, and we cannot determine morality from science or meaning from science. So origin proofs. Creation cannot be proved. That's very clear by science. Not taking place now, it's completed, not accessible to use of the scientific method, and can't devise an experiment to describe the creation process. And the same thing is true for evolution. It cannot be proved. If it is taking place, operates too slowly to measure. Transmutation would take millions of years for us to see anything. Obviously, we're not around that long. So evolution cannot be proved. The scientific method cannot be used to measure it. And we do see small variations in organisms. They are observed today, but they're not relevant because that does not help us to distinguish between creation and evolution if the variations are too small to draw that conclusion. And another way to look at the difference between science and belief system is this. If we can run an experiment in the present, we can repeat the experiment. We can have somebody else repeat the experiment. It's observable. That's science. Okay, that you can use the scientific method. If something happened in the past, obviously, whatever it was that happened in the past is not repeatable. But we do have good eyewitness accounts. Okay, and we trust those eyewitnesses for various reasons. That's history. Okay, so we got science, we got history. If it's not that, we have to consider it happened in the past. It's not repeatable. We can't go and repeat the evolution or creation process. There are no eyewitnesses. That is a belief. So when it comes down to it, both creation and evolution are what we believe to be true. So with that in mind, with those definitions, let's look at these 5 challenges to evolution. I would claim that macroevolution has never been observed. I would claim that there are no credible transitional fossils, that life cannot and did not originate from non-life by random chance processes. And fourth, evolution actually violates the second law of thermodynamics. So these are the 4 science things we're going to look at, and then conclude with evolution is only a theory. It has not been proven. So now we're going to step through these 4 things. Macroevolution. First of all, what is it? Molecules to man, common descent, emergence of new advanced features via mutations and natural selection. That defines macroevolution, Darwinian evolution. Simple to complex living organism requires an increase of genetic information. Do we see a way of increasing the genetic information in this macroevolution process? So this, sometimes we physicists say it's a go to you. Macroevolution requires an increase in genetic information, because if everything starts from one simple living cell, how do we get all these different living organisms and living plants? There must be an increase in the genetic information in that living organism. So we would say that macroevolution has not been and is not being observed today. However, microevolution is observed. What do we mean by microevolution again? Genetic variation, and this can be either the appearance of or the disappearance of existing and potential genetic traits through recombination of existing genetic code. So there are various ways that we see microevolution happening. Adaptive variations arising from the existing genetic potential already in the populations existing pool. In other words, it's a living organism, and the living organisms have different traits, different complexity, and okay, then examples of a microevolution. I mentioned Darwin's finches before. That's often used as proof for evolution in the evolution literature. However, yes, there are changes in the beaks of those finches during wet periods and dry periods. The ones that are better adapted to the environment survive. However, they're all still finches. So this is within the microevolution. The peppered moths on a tree. You've seen that experiment in the UK. A lot of problems with that experiment, but yes, the color of the moth could change from, or could appear to be changed from white to dark. But that doesn't mean that, there's still moths at the end of all that. And some people would say that, certain insects or other living beings develop resistance to pesticide. So they appear to gather this capability over time. But the issue is that they're still the same insects, okay? They just have slightly different variations. All observed change involves sorting and loss of genetic information. Evolution, macroevolution, does not allow for, the macroevolution requires much more significant changes than we see here, because you cannot gain new information. There's no way to do that through this process. You may have heard of the Budinsky fruit fly experiment. Okay, this was done because fruit flies can reproduce very quickly. So you can have hundreds of generations of fruit flies over a very short period of time. So scientists said, well, let's try and see if we can get some changes to propagate. Well, here's what happened. They were radiation-induced mutations of these fruit flies. It involves deliberate action. This is not a natural, because we're using some radiation to make these changes happen. So the result was, and I think I've heard numbers like 40,000 generations. The experiment was run over a long period of time. But fruit flies with extra wings or no wings or huge wings or tiny wings, they did it happen. But these don't reproduce. Okay, so they don't carry this trait along. It's because of the damage that was done, the mutation that some of these happens. There are no advantages over other fruit flies, and they're still fruit flies. So there's no progressive beneficial changes from simple to complex. So that experiment, did not prove evolution. Then again, there's no increase in quantity or quality of the genetic information. There's a loss for that. Now I'm going to give you some definitions or some statements by people that believe in evolution. And some of these you may find surprising. Roger Lewin, at a conference in Chicago, made this statement. The central question of the Chicago conference was whether the mechanisms underlying microevolution can be extrapolated to explain the phenomena of macroevolution. At the risk of doing violence to the positions of some of the people at the meeting, the answer can be given as a clear no. In other words, microevolution is limited in what it can do. It cannot go into macroevolution. This is an evolutionist speaking. Here's a book which really impressed me. This was written by another scientist, Lee Spetner. Some of you may have heard of him. But he decided he had some questions about evolution because he couldn't see random chance mutations causing beneficial changes to living organisms. So in summary, this is what he said. But in all the reading I've done in the life science literature, I've never found a mutation that added information. All point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information and not to increase it. I happen to have if you can see this, I have a copy of that book, and I have it listed in the references that I show you later on the end of this talk. So he concludes that random chance mutations and natural selections are opposites. In other words, there is something within the living organism that allows it to adapt to the environment, and without going, using chance random mutations. So here's another quote from him. If adaptive mutations are stimulated by the environment, they contradict the basic dogma of neo-Darwinism, that mutations are random and the kind of mutations that occur are independent of the environment. If mutations are non-random, in other words, they have a fixed response to that, and or the environment can stimulate adaptive mutations, the paradigm of Darwinian evolution, which has dominated the biological science for close to 150 years, must be replaced. So here's a scientist coming to the conclusion that, random chance mutations just do not work for evolution. And he's not the only scientist. I'll come to another few later on here. So a little bit about mutations and information, Darwinism and the deterioration of the genome. And I've said before that most mutations are bad or neutral. There are very, very few good mutations that provide new information to change the living organism. This is written by Dr. Jerry Bergman, who is a very prolific author. He has written many books on creation versus evolution. And so he's done his homework. So DNA, RNA mutations, they cannot provide significant new levels of information. By chance, they may produce one or two here and there, but they more likely produce degradation of the information in the genome. And of course, this is counter to the prediction of neo-Darwinism. Research shows that no good example of a beneficial information gaining mutation. Very few mutations are beneficial, less than 0.01%, but there are thousands of deleterious mutations. So that's what the conclusion that Jerry came to. And he's written a number of books, not just on this topic, but also on fossils and things like that. Then we come to another book. This is a book written by Dr. John Sanford from Cornell University. He's written a book called Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome. I have a copy here as well. You'll see that listed in my references. So he's one that used to believe in evolution, but then when students asked him questions, how do you prove it? He came to the conclusion it really doesn't work. So he started to question the primary axioms. And the primary axiom, of course, is random genetic mutations and natural selection. That's how changes happen, and they change for the better. This is an action that is untestable, yet is accepted as absolute truth, because this is the Darwinian evolution. This is supposedly how it happened. The reality is that mutations are mostly harmful. You've heard of people getting cancer, and that's because they have mutations in their cells. Random mutations destroy information. The more mutation you have, you're losing information. Selection can't eliminate all bad mutations. Each of us are collecting mutations in our bodies, generation by generation. And good mutations turn out to be mostly unselectable. Okay, so that's the book he wrote. And here a little bit more about that. This comes from his book. If you want to get a copy of that book, most mutations are neutral or bad. And you can see here the selection zone. This is the mutation effect. There is very little a selection zone available, like here, the mutations. Okay, but further out, you don't get many mutations. So the chance of selection of good mutations is essentially zero. You do get some, but can you reproduce them is the question. And this conclusion agrees with Dr. Spetner from the other book I showed you. So here's an explanation of that diagram here. This is a Kimura diagram, and it's from Sanford in his book of 2005. He's actually got an updated book, 2008, showing where beneficial mutations would occur. Their distribution is reduced in range and scale by a factor of 10,000 to 1 million. This part of the mutation distribution could not be drawn small enough, and a relatively large triangle is shown just to the right of the 0 point. Even with beneficial mutations greatly exaggerated, essentially all beneficial mutations will still fail. Will still fall within the Kimura's no selection zone. That's here, this no selection zone. And the other evidence we do have of our human genome deteriorating as well, and this is some work that John Sanford has done as well. There is no form of selection of living organisms that can stop the genetic deterioration. They can only slow it down. We could improve our diet and we can slow things down a bit, but we can't stop it all. Here's a chart showing the lifespan of Noah's descendants. And remember, Noah lived just over 600 years. And but after Noah, the lifespan went from 600, 700 years all the way down over these centuries since Noah's time, and we're now down at about 70 or 80. Okay, so that's, there's something here. Those mutations are limiting our lifespan. Let me read the writing under the figure. I don't think you can see it all. Human lifespans in early history, when biblical lifespans are plotted against time for generations after Noah, a dramatic decline in life expectancy is shown. The curve shows a strong evidence of biological decay. It reveals an exponential curve following the formula y equal, and I won't read the formula, it's in the picture here too, but it's a very complicated formula. The curve is consistent with the concept of genomic degeneration caused by mutation accumulation. So that just shows, our bodies are deteriorating. We have more and more mutations with every generation. Living organisms show a process of de-evolution called genetic entropy. In other words, the entropy is, the unusable. It is devolving. So we are not evolving to a more powerful living organism, but we're actually devolving. Mutation accumulation causes genomic deterioration. So our genome is deteriorating. In other words, the primary axiom pointed to by Darwin just doesn't work. And then we come to another biologist, Lynn Margulis. She was an American scientist also working in this time. Here's what she has to say. Many biologists claim they know for sure that random mutation, in other words, purposeless chance, is a source of inherited variation that generates new species of life. No, I say it. No, it does not work. New mutations don't create new species. They create offspring that are impaired. So each generation is impaired with more mutations. So in summary of these mutation studies by these four scientists, Spetner, Bergman, Sanford, and Margulis, we come to these conclusions. The changes are adaptive. Living mechanisms can adapt to their environment, but they're not random mutations. More changes because of adapting come to the environment. Again, this is built into their genome. So it's not irrespective of the environment. There are environmental forces at work here. But it's also controlled by built-in cellular processes, and it leads to limited genetic and phenotypic changes. So you can't change it to a much more, to a more complex living organism, and the changes are mostly bad. So the adaptive mutation is not a mechanism for evolution, but for adaptation. And that's what we refer to as microevolution. So macroevolution assumes production of new information by mutations, but mutations cannot provide the source of genetic information needed for selection. And then finally, we see mutational deterioration of the genome. So, and just to finish up here, we do see speciation happening. There is selection and speciation happening. Darwin provided no direct evidence for selection in natural population. He promoted the artificial selection, and yes, that works up to a point. But natural artificial selection involved only minor changes within existing species. We can make a stronger horse, we can make a cow that gives more milk, but they are minor changes. Evolution requires speciation, not local adaptations and differentiations of populations. Artificial selection demonstrated the limits experimentally, but the primary speciation, the splitting of one species into two, has never been observed. There are changes in the species at the species level, but it's not through the primary axiom, as Darwin would have us believe. Okay, so now second, I would claim that there are no transitional fossils. You may remember, of course, that Darwin in his book, Origin of Species, admitted that he had not found any transitional fossils that supported his theory, but he expected over the next 100 years that evidence of these transitions would be found. But so far, as I'll show you, we have not found them. The Cambrian explosion, the bottom layer of the sedimentary layers, the Cambrian explosion, it seems like most of the phyla that we know today came to be at the all at once in the Cambrian explosion, and we have a hard time explaining that. Living fossils, some living organisms which were assumed to be extinct, they were found actually later on. And the one case that has been shown is the coelacanth fish. That we had fossils of that fish, but there were no living organisms. Nobody was catching those fish. Well, in 1938, they did catch one, and they compared the fossil with the living fish, and they look about the same. Polystrate fossils. What do we mean by that? Well, here's a tree, okay, and there's a whole bunch of different sedimentary layers there, even tens of feet apart, hundreds of feet apart in some cases, and they go through the tree goes through all of those layers. Well, these layers, if they took millions or billions of years to lay down, that tree didn't live all that time. That's what we call a polystrate fossils. So there's a lack of empirical evidence for transitions. The Archaeopteryx was claimed to be a fossil which showed this as a transitional fossil, but the more people looked at it, the more they said, no, it's not a transition between a reptile and a bird. It is really the fossil of a bird. And similarly, whale evolution has been debunked, and horse evolution has been debunked. And I've got a few books on that. There's one book that I didn't show yet. It was the Icons of Evolution, written by Jonathan Wells of the Discovery Institute 25 years ago. And he goes through many of the things that were assumed to be evidence for evolution and shows, especially the whale evolution, the horse evolution, Archaeopteryx, they were not transitional fossils. And the other thing that Dr. Bergman has written on extensively, and also in the book, Icons of Evolution, when you look at the samples that are put forth, which says evolution will say this proves that there was some evolution from an ape-like creature to a human. When you look at it more deeply, they don't prove that at all. So this Cambrian explosion again. At the bottom layer, okay, many of the phyla that we know today show up there. Only soft-bodied organisms found in the Precambrian here. And then the number of species fossilized in the higher layers decreases in each higher layer. In other words, some of these animals and plants even have become extinct. That you may find them in these bottom layers, but they didn't make it up to here. They went extinct. So here's some examples of living fossils. The coelacanth fish I mentioned. Here you have a fossil, and you compare that fossil to a living fish today, found in 1938, and they're still finding them. Those look about the same. So there was no major transition between these two. And another one here, 25 million year old termite fossil in amber here. You look at that here, compared with termites today, and you don't see the changes that Darwin might have predicted in the fossil record. So, okay, then I show this polystrate fossil. Okay, polystrate fossils run through several strata, sedimentary layers or rock layers. And how can that be unless those layers were laid down quickly? And some of you may have heard of the Mount St. Helens eruption that occurred in 1980, where you see examples of all these tree stumps. Okay, and you'll see that the bottoms of the tree stumps, there's layers of sediments which cover the lower layers, like they do here. So trees sinking in an upright position in Spirit Lake following the eruption of Mount St. Helens. And then we come to the hominid fossils, that supposedly show that some ape-like creature, and of course the chimps also were regarded possibly in this string. But the more you look at it, and there's another writer who has written books on this. He's done extensive studies on this. And I've done some talks on this, but I'm just going to give you the high-level view of this. The neothandril found in Croatia and France, it has now been, there were hundreds of fossils of these creatures found, but they have now been accepted as a Homo sapiens, as a human. Java man, found in 91. It is now regarded as an artificial construct. Piltdown man, supposedly found in the UK, but it was proven to be a hoax. Nebraska man, based on an extinct pig. And of course, so that is useless as an example. Ramapithecus is now regarded as an orangutan. And another one, the most recent one of the most recent ones that gets a lot of press and has got, it's in 1974. But when you look at it, it really turns out to be a make-believe creature. And I'm going to show you a few more slides on that. But all the other ones, they're well documented in the books that these do not prove, the origin of man. So there are no credible ape-like human fossils found. They've all been debunked so far. So we look at Lucy. Some of the bones of Lucy were discovered in 1974 by Donald Johansen. They found about 40% of the skeleton. Now, they didn't find all the pieces, laying down like this. They found different pieces in different places in the sediments. And here's how they put it together. It looked like this is what it was before it got crushed. It was dated to be 3.5 million years old. One thing that they measured the arm-leg ratio. Okay, we have arms and we have legs. So the arm-leg ratio was 83.9%. That's what's expected. The hip is such, the hip pelvis, it looks like it might have walked upright. But again, if you look, where's the hip? Where is the pelvis? I mean, the pelvis is here, but there's nothing with the hip there. And then the knee joint. Well, again, you don't have a complete knee joint. Okay, so this is a guesswork in some case. The observations were the fingers were long and curved, and that's what you would expect in an ape-like creature or a gorilla or chimpanzees. So the shoulder blade looked like that of a gorilla. The brain size looked like the size of a chimpanzee. So then, they've reconstructed that. And looking more closely at the bones there, checking the facts, we find that the leg bone was broken in two places and one end was crushed. And so this invalidates the ratio of the arm to the leg. So that can't be used to justify that this was a human ancestor. Hip pelvis was incomplete and thus reshaped to make it look as if it walked upright. And the knee joint was found over 1 mile away, 200 feet deeper in the strata from the rest of the bones. And so you have this picture in the museum like this. Okay, humans have, we as humans have very little hair. Apes have a lot of hair. So how did they decide how much hair to put on this skeleton here? And notice that it has a foot, toes. That was not part of that picture at all. So that's why I say this is a make-believe creature to make it look like it's halfway between some ape-like creature and man, because it doesn't have as much hair as an ape, and it does have, it has less than an ape, and it has more than most humans would be expected to have. So it's the fossil remains of two different creatures fitted to form a make-believe creature. And here you can see in closer details, here's the 40% skeleton of it all. And this is what they show in the St. Louis Museum. Notice how it's glancing as if it's, thinking. Notice the fingers here look like pretty human-like. And, the rest of the body looks very human-like. But it was total reconstruction of what they wanted to see. So this is from the PBS Nova series, In Search of Human Origins, and done in 1994. Lucy's pelvis is very wrong, looks very ape-like, and fixing Lucy with a power saw. They actually took his pelvis and cut off some pieces to make it look more like human-like. So what do some of the evolutionists think of all this? Well, here's Lord Slickerman. He says, for example, no scientist could logically dispute the proposition that man, without having been involved in any act of divine creation, evolved from some ape-like creature in a very short space of time, speaking in geological terms without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of the transformation. So again, we don't have what they're looking for. Ape-like to man. Here's another scientist, Lyle Watson. He states, the fossils that decorate our family tree, that's the human tree, are so scarce that there are still more scientists than specimens. The remarkable fact is that all the physical evidence we have for human evolution can still be placed with room to spare inside a single coffin. So here, evolution's admitting they don't have enough evidence. Here's two other well-known evolutionists, David Pilbeam and Stephen Gould. Unfortunately, the fossil record of pungids, apes, is non-existent, making a glaring deficiency in the whole story. So human evolution has been effectively buried. There is no evidence for that. Another quote from Simpson, well-known evolutionist, he said, every paleontologist knows that most new species, genera, and families, and that nearly all categories above the level of family appear in the record suddenly and are not led up to by known, gradual, completely continuous transitional sequences. So again, we don't have the evidence. A quote from West, another evolutionist, says, contrary to what most scientists write, the fossil record does not support the Darwinian theory of evolution because it is this theory, and there are several, which we use to interpret the fossil record. So by so doing, we are guilty of circular reasoning if we then say the fossil record supports this theory. So we got a problem. Now there's a book written by Duane Gish, a well-known creationist, and he has written two books. He wrote a book in 1985, I think it was the first one, and he wrote a second one in 1995. The first one was called Evolution, the Fossils Say No. And then when he had another book written in 10 years later, he said, the fossils still say no. So in the preceding chapters, we have cited example after example of failure to find transitional forms where evolutionary theory predicts such forms should have been found. The examples are cited in this book are in no way exceptions, but serve to illustrate what is characteristic of the fossil record. So even Darwin, when he wrote the book, The Origin of Species, he admitted in 1859, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. Paul Moody, in a book, a standard textbook that our students see, so far as we can judge from the geological record, large changes seem usually to have arisen suddenly. Fossil forms intermediate between large subdivisions of classification, such as orders and classes, are seldom found. Read, never found. Very strong wording by evolutionists themselves. Darwin admitted he didn't have the evidence, but he expected scientists to find that evidence in time. Here's another one, Dr. Colin Patterson, senior paleontologist, British Museum of Natural History. He wrote this after 150 years after Darwin. And in that book, he was asked why, or by people that came to his museum, they asked the question, why don't you show any examples of these transitions in the human evolution? He said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one might make a watertight argument. And then another Douglas Futuma, who is a textbook writer, he says, it is considered likely that all the animal phyla became distinct before or during the Cambrian, for they all appear fully formed without intermediates connecting one phylum to another. So he admits there are no fossils that connect between the phyla. And here is, I picked up one of these charts here. This from a dinosaur family tree. And there are more charts like this. This one is actually from the University of Chicago. But there are many more like this. They're trying to recreate the family tree for dinosaurs. And so they have found fossils for dinosaurs, at different layers. And the red line here says, these are, the fossils look about the same for these different kinds of types of dinosaurs. But then below a certain level, we don't have any evidence. So that's why you see dotted lines connecting them. And then, this here, these two in at different times. So then suddenly these dotted lines appear and you got the blue and more dotted lines, and so on down. This does not all come down, they do show it here coming down to one dinosaur, kind of a fossil, actually a number of them, but they're all connected by dotted lines. So the connections are made up. Okay, these are different phyla of dinosaurs. And yes, there are some fossils for dinosaurs which appear for a long period of time, but the connection to other fossils is not there. So then we come to, I mentioned Duane Gish. Okay, he wrote one book called The Fossils Say No. And then later on, about 12 years later, the fossils still say no. And then Jonathan Wells, the book that I showed you here, he also explains that there's no evidence for human evolution, and there's no evidence for the fossil connections that they're looking for. This is the icons of evolution. And then recently, Dr. Carl Werner, he has spent years, starting from, I think it was 1979, and he came up with 5 books, on the fossil record and human evolution, and all of them show that the theory of evolution does not have evidence that proves that evolution happened. So these are just some recent books. There are many, many more, and I can't go all into them, but they're well known. Okay, then we come to a third argument here, is that life could not originate from non-life by random chance. So in the days of the Greek, they thought that new life could come through spontaneous generation. In other words, suddenly life could come through some kind of a chemical evolution. But when it came down to it, if you run experiments, there's no way to prove that could happen and that it even happened in the past. These 4 scientists, Reddy, Spallanzani, Pasteur, and Virchow, they all ran experiments which show that life cannot start from non-life, in actuality, because when they run the experiments, they made sure they protected the experiments. And so they came up with the law of biogenesis. In other words, that law which says life can only come from life. Life cannot come from non-life. So the law of biogenesis is a law that has never been falsified. So non-complex life is in fact impossible. People are running experiments today to try and show, yes, spontaneous generation didn't happen, but what if we had the right environment and tried to create new life? And this is the experience called abiogenesis. Well, first of all, here's what they face. The simplest self-reproducing organism, the mycoplasma, has 482 genes and 580,000 letters or base pairs. This requires parasitizing a more complex organism. How did you get some organism that complex that could replicate itself? And the parasitism results from loss of genetic information. In other words, again, back to information is lost, we can't add complexity. So what are the components of life? Well, proteins. What are proteins made of? A chain of amino acids. The DNA, the double helix, master genetic code, information for cell activities. This is discovered in 1953. You see a picture of a living cell here. RNA, the ribonucleic acid, single strand, not double helix, protein building instruction. This is how you build proteins. And then but for all this to happen, there has to be a catalyst for transcription. And there has to be a replication take place so you can replicate the living organisms and reproduce the living organism. And importantly, there has to be a cell membrane. All these things could not hang together in one cell without there being a membrane. So, but you clearly, what we have is a chicken and egg effect. Did the RNA come first? No. Could the proteins come first? No. So because RNA is required to build proteins, and it's also required to build DNA. So you have a chicken and egg problem. And furthermore on this, well, first of all, talk about simplicity of known living organisms. And how do we know some of this? Well, in Darwin's day, he knew nothing about that. He just thought living organisms were just little blobs that fit together somehow. But now with the electron microscope, we can look deep into a cell and see all the parts. Okay, and so but still the smallest bacteria has 482 genes, 600 types of proteins, 580,000 base pairs, DNA. And the probability of chance of this forming by chance, all these pieces come together by chance, is zero. It's not going to happen. So if that can't happen, ask the question, how do you come up with the human genome, which is 3 billion base pairs? Well, you can't. So the other thing is going into this, life from non-life. The evolution presupposition is there's only two material fundamental entities, mass and energy. So everything happens because of mass and energy. What mass can convert into energy, energy can go back to mass. Einstein's equation proved that. But what most evolutionists don't take into consideration is the information is the third entity, and that is non-material. And I'll show you what I mean by that. These mass and energy, you can put your hands on, you can see that. But information is non-material. So information is encoded within the DNA and RNA of all plant animal cells. So the information is in the DNA. Life could not exist without information. So life is material, mass and energy, plus non-material information. All these are required for life. Now, if you look at information, what do we mean by information? Well, the easiest way to understand that is the four components that make up information. Code, meaning, putting codes together, and action and purpose. Okay, I'm going to give a few examples of what we mean by that. So information in biological systems, what do we have? We have the codes, the amino acids, the 4 different types, A, C, C, and G. A and T always come together into a base pair, and C and G always come into a base pair. And you can have 3 of these letters make up different codons, and you have 64 different codons. So this is what is required for life. Each 3-letter word represents one of the 20 amino acids necessary for protein life. I'm sure you've heard of the Miller experiment, where Miller tried to show with the right environment and the right pieces of one could produce living material. Well, it turned out he did produce some amino acids, but what they didn't realize, and that they don't tell you in your textbooks, is that amino acids come in 2 forms, the left-handed amino acids and right-handed amino acids. So, but life consists only of the 20 left-handed amino acids. The Miller experiment, produced both, and that does not help produce life. Sequence of codons in the DNA represents sequence of amino acids in a protein. So here we got code, we got meaning, and then the action. Proteins are needed for construction, function, maintenance, reproduction of the organism and its cellular components. And then purpose. What's the purpose of all this, of this information? It's reproduction of life. Life comes from life. Life does not come from non-life. So complexity of the cell, I'm sure you've seen pictures like this. I won't go into it, but you need that membrane, you need a nucleus, and you need chromosomes and ribosomes and a whole bunch of other stuff. Very, very complex. That's not going to happen by chance. So because you look at probability, chance of getting all heads in a row when flipping a coin, you can calculate those. 1 head in a row, 2 heads in a row, 1 in 4, 3 heads in a row, 1 in 8, 10, 100, 1,000. So you're up to 10 to the power of 300. What's the chance of you throwing a coin and hitting 1,000 heads in a row? And it is a real coin. It is balanced between has a head on one side and someone else on the other side. So the probability of life, a single protein consists of amino acids. A protein is made up of one of those 20 left-handed amino acids in a certain sequence. In this case, we're looking at one at 400 amino acids in a row. The probability of forming that protein is 1 in 10 to the power of 240. The single cell, the probability of producing a single cell, of course, is so small it'll never happen. 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. So spontaneous formation of life is not going to happen. There are only 10 to the 80th atoms in the universe. The law of probability says anything smaller than 1 in 10 to the 50th is not going to happen. So all of these numbers here, they're much bigger than 10 to the 50th. So it's not going to happen by chance. The probability is not going to happen. So here's a mathematician who in the UK who confirms that. He says the likelihood of the spontaneous formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number of 40,000 noughts after it. It is big enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There are no primordial soup, neither on this planet nor on any other, and if the beginning of life were not random, they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence. So the origin of life. Here's what we say. That I have another presentation which talks more about the information, what we mean by that, and why it's impossible to form a living cell without information. So at the origin of life, here's this biologist. He says, research on the origin of life seems to be unique in that the conclusion has already been authoritatively accepted. What remains to be done is to find the scenarios which describe in detailed mechanisms and processes by which this happened. One must conclude that contrary to the established and current wisdom, a scenario describing the genesis of life on Earth by chance and natural causes, which can be accepted on the basis of fact and not faith, has not yet been written. Okay, here's another evolutionist, Leslie Orville. He says, prebiotic soup is easy to obtain. We must next explain how a prebiotic soup of organic molecules, including amino acids and the organic constituents of nucleotides, evolved into a self-replicating organism. While some suggestive evidence has been obtained, I must admit that attempts to reconstruct this evolutionary process are extremely tentative. Paul Davies, an evolutionist from Australia, here's what he says about living matter and information. His conclusion is a shame that there are precious few hard facts when it comes to the origin of life. We have a rough idea when it began on Earth and some interesting theories about where, but the how part has everybody stumped. Nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organize themselves into the first living cell. Here's an evologist. Here's a creation scientist who knows all about information. He's actually an information scientist from Germany, and said there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. In other words, you cannot have information without intelligent agent behind it. So origin of first life from non-life by natural process is impossible. And I didn't cover all these four in detail, but the first one was that law of biogenesis has never been falsified. That law says life only comes from life. Abiogenesis experiments always failed. The Miller experiment, yes, it produced amino acids, but didn't produce the right ones. And it was also a designed experiment. It didn't happen by natural processes. So all experiments, and then people are still doing experiments, they have all failed. 3, the mathematical probability of irreducible complex and a self-replicator. And others, by irreducible complexity, that means all the parts of the living cell must be there for it to work. And it must be able to replicate. Okay, so that the probability of that happening by chance is 0, can't happen. So information, that doesn't come from random chance processes. It is, information that is non-material, and it requires an intelligent agent. Okay, so then we come to the fourth one, and this is probably a little harder to understand, but I'm going to say evolution and the second law of thermodynamics do not quite agree with each other. So what's the second law of thermodynamics? Increasing entropy, unavailable energy. And I think you all agree that everything is going from order to disorder. And everything is running down. There's less usable energy over time in our universe. However, evolution requires that we go from a simple living organism to a much more complex living organism. So it is going in the opposite direction from thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics. Now, there's more to that, as you'll see. So what we do observe in nature is that order goes to disorder, deterioration of the genome, less available energy over time, increased randomness over time. So let's look a little bit at this. The classical thermodynamic experiment or definition, thermodynamics and entropy. Energy can never be 100% converted to work. Okay, you're always going to lose some available energy. Entropy is the amount of unavailable energy. First discovered in the study of energy and heat engines that convert heat into work. And so, yeah, many of these things we have only learned in the last few hundred years. This hasn't always been known. Statistical, so it's classical thermodynamics, statistical entropy, energy to construct and maintain complex systems. Where does that energy come from? All organized systems tend to become more random and disorderly. Our genome, for example, as we saw, is running down. Informational entropy applies to transmission and storage of information. You know, we are losing information. That applies to transmission. We try to transmit information from one place to another. We are losing information, and we have to account for that. So there are no known exceptions to this second law of thermodynamics as laid out here. Here's Isaac Asimov, a well-known evolutionist. And he said, another way of stating the second law then is the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. Okay, this is his way of describing the second law. Viewed that way, we can see the second law all about us. We have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself, it becomes a mess again very quickly and very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery and our bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is nothing, and everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out, all by itself. That is what the second law is all about. So that's his definition. So if we apply it, and here's the other way of looking at it, if you believe in the Big Bang, you know, how that happened, you know, some speck expanded, explosion, whatever, you know, that is chaos. You know, explosions produce chaos. So so we have something simple, hydrogen and helium atoms to start with, and then things evolve, and you get more, you know, complex components. You get stars, you get the Earth and the sun and the moon, and so everything gets much more complex. So you're going from from disorder to order. There's also the issue about open versus closed systems. You know, said, well, you can't apply this to the second law to evolution because you know, we're not dealing with a closed system. The evolutionists argue the second law only applies to a closed system. Living systems are exceptions because they represent open systems. Solar energy is added to the Earth. Well, that is true. But the second law applies to the whole universe. Entropy is increasing in the whole universe. Things become less organized, less complex, more random in the universe. Raw solar energy increases entropy. When we shine, or the sun shines on the earth and it's shining on a piece of iron, it's going to turn that iron into rust. Okay, so raw solar energy shining on a dead piece of you know, material, it is going to you know, eat it almost, creating rust. So you got the less usable energy. Here's another you know, scientist, evolutionist even. He says there are no known violations of the second law of thermodynamics. Ordinarily, the second law is stated for isolated systems, but the second law applies equally well to open systems. There is somehow associated with the field of far-off equilibrium phenomena the notion that the second law of thermodynamics fails for such systems. It's important to make sure that this error does not perpetuate itself. So he's all for, you know, considering the open system. Well, or for considering closed systems. Well, you could say, well, the Earth is a closed system, but actually it's not. it's open because we got energy coming from the sun and shines on the earth. So there's an apparent increase in organized complexity in living matter. We know, you plant a seed in your garden, and if you shine the sun and water it, it will grow. It'll turn into a flower or, tomato or whatever. So we have an open system. So, and we have an available energy source. So we got both of these necessary, but it also, for this to work, it requires two other things. It requires a program. Now there's information, DNA. Plants and animals, they all have information in the DNA, and they have programs in the DNA. Okay, so you need a program here, but you also need a mechanism for storing and converting the incoming energy, and you do have that here. When you look at photosynthesis, here's an example: plant photosynthesis. The sun's energy shines on the the ground initially. The seed sprouts up, and then the sun takes over and adds energy. But there is a storage system. There's a program in that plant which tells it how to grow, when to break out across the earth there, and when the leaves come on, and when the petals of the flower come on. That's all programmed. That's the information. And it has a way to store energy, because when the sun goes down, this energy is stored in that plant. So both of these mechanisms are required: a program to direct the growth and a mechanism. And then I mentioned the seed to a plant. Well, you have the example here. Well, what about animals? Well, they use metabolism. We eat, cows eat digestible food, and then we have metabolism, which breaks down the food and helps the animal to grow and survive. So living systems have a program, and that's in the DNA to direct the process of building an organism. Process continues throughout the life of the organisms faster than natural processes via the second law can break it down. So living systems have a storage and conversion built-in mechanism to convert and store energy. Photosynthesis converts sun's energy into usable, storable forms like proteins, and animals use metabolism to convert and use stored, usable energy from organisms in their diets. So that's all making it go in a different direction than second law of thermodynamics, which caused everything to run down. Here we're adding information and complexity. Some people say, well, look at there's order in the systems that we see as well. Look at the salt crystals with sodium and chloride. That's order. Yes, there's order there because there's a force holding those two together. There's an algorithm for doing that. And so but for organized systems, are different from ordered systems. So the organized systems are distinguished from ordered systems. Neither kind of system is random, but whereas ordered systems are generated according to simple algorithms, therefore lack complexity, like salt crystals and snowflakes, organized systems must be assembled element by element according to an external wiring diagram, okay, with a high information content, and that is living organisms. Organization then is functional complexity and carries information. It is non-random by design or by selection rather than by the a priori necessity of crystallographic order. So here's the difference. Examples of order in nature. I mentioned the salt crystal, but there are other crystals as well, the snowflake, the stalactites, lightning, etc. They are, there's order in nature. It does not require an intelligent program. There's bonding that occurs that makes these things happen. But in the organized complexity, all living things, even single-celled organisms, they have organized complexity with information, each functioning according to its instructions in the DNA. Remember, spontaneous generation has been disproved by these 4 scientists, and life from non-life has never been observed. So the challenge posed by the second law, here's another evolutionist, C.J. Smith. The thermodynamicist immediately clarifies the latter question by pointing out that the second law classically refers to isolated systems which exchange neither energy nor matter with the environment. Biological systems are open and exchange both energy and matter. The explanation, however, is not completely satisfying because it still leaves open the problem of how or why the ordering process has arisen, an apparent lowering of the entropy, and a number of scientists have wrestled with this issue. So yes, there's more discussions going on, but largely this is not a problem. So finally, we come to our conclusion here. Evolution is only theory. As you can see, it has not been proven. A working general biological meaning of evolution to most evolution is this: a continuous, naturalistic, mechanistic process by which all living things have arisen from a single living source, which itself arose by a similar process from a non-living, inanimate world. So a theory, like evolution, implies these things. It must be self-consistent. It must agree with observations, and it must be useful. It must serve some purpose. So let's look at those 3 things. Evolution as a process is not self-consistent. You see in one of my first slides, we had different definitions of evolution that people float from one to the other to help support their theory, but that doesn't work. In the varied and contradictory camps connected with thermodynamics, phylogeny, proposed mechanisms, and various sub-theories, etc., they don't all hang together. So it does not agree with observations. We talked about the fossil record. We haven't talked about geology in this talk here, but there's other talks on that. And genetics we've touched on, but there are some other lectures on that topic. Molecular biology, thermodynamics, various dating methods, radiometric dating. We haven't discussed that either. But there's a whole bunch of problems there. And probability mathematics, we've talked about a bit as well. But, the probability of evolution happening by chance, it just doesn't happen mathematically. So also evolution has not been proven useful. No new advancements in scientific knowledge or technology because people believe in evolution. Science does not require belief in evolution. In fact, in some cases, there are no advancements in medicine, hindered in some cases because of false claims that are now discarded. You may have heard of the term vestigial organs. In other words, evolution was thought that we have some organs in our bodies that are left over from evolution that we don't really need. We can live without our appendix. We can live without some other organs. We can function just fine. However, they do serve a purpose, many of these organs, in our immune system. We can live without it, but we're better with them. So there's no positive contribution to society through evolution-based social scientists. Just as sometimes evolution is used to justify racism, Nazism, communism, other sizes, ideological ills, and that's a whole other talk on that, which we won't go into here. So evolution cannot be proved. It operates too slowly to be measurable if it is taking place. The scientific method cannot be used to measure it. The small variations in organisms observed today are not relevant. They can't be used to distinguish between creation and evolution. Dr. Herbert Nilsson makes this quote. He's the director of the Botanical Institute of Lund University in Sweden, said, "My attempt to demonstrate evolution by an experiment carried on for more than 40 years has completely failed. The idea of an evolution rests on pure belief." Another one by Colin Patterson noted, "No one has ever produced a species by mechanisms of natural selection. No one has ever gotten near it, and most of the current arguments in Darwinism is about this question." So evolution is found wanting, has never been observed, the macroevolution that is. There are no credible transitional fossils. Life can and did not originate from non-life by chance, and evolution violates the second law of thermodynamics. And finally, evolution is just a theory, and even that is unproven. So here, the next two slides, I've just listed some reference books that I use. Some of them I mentioned, Dwayne Gish and Jonathan Wells, for example. But there's also a very interesting pair of books by Richard Dawkins. He wrote a book called The Greatest Show on Earth, which says, "This demonstrate why evolution can be explained." And Jonathan Sarfati from Creation Ministries International, he wrote a book refuting what Darwin had to say, because scientifically it cannot be proven. So those are two very interesting books to look at. I mentioned Lee Spetner's book and John Sanford. I didn't mention this book by the Susan Mazar, who's a journalist. He wrote a book, she wrote a book called The Altenberg 16, an expose of the evolution industry, which 16 well-known evolutionists got together in 2009 and tried to come up with another way that evolution could work, because the mechanism that is demonstrated or determined by Darwin just does not work. So they need another mechanism to come up with. So also a very interesting book. And some other books by Sarfati. Another interesting book by creation scientist Nathaniel Jensen, Replacing Darwin, The New Origin of Species. I have that here as well. A very well-written book where he tries to explain what is really going on there. It's not evolution. Darwin's Bluff is a book that just came out a year ago. It's called Darwin's Bluff, The Mystery of the Book Darwin Never Finished. Because if you think of the book Origin of Species, written in 1859, it really did not provide any examples of the origin of any one species. And Darwin knew that. He said, okay, I'll write another book which will give the evidence for that. He started to write that, but he stopped halfway because he realized he could not prove it. And then Carl Werner, I mentioned, he has written 5 volumes on the grand experiment on looking at evolution from a science perspective, and has determined that evolution, macroevolution, just does not work. And also, you can look at some of these web references later. And I will make these slides available to people that want to look at them in general. So with that, I'm going to draw this to a conclusion. All of my messages that I do on this topic, they're all on my website, as I list here. Just look under heinzlyclama.com/messages. And I hope this has been a useful discussion for you. And I look forward to getting a few comments, questions, what have you.
Dr. Heinz, that was an excellent presentation, very thorough. I appreciate how well-rounded it was as well. You touched on a number of important topics. And like I said in the introduction, if you believe in common descent, if you believe in evolution and you're in the chat here this evening, and you consider all of this evidence and data points as an objective thinker, this program may just challenge your assumptions and challenge your beliefs and potentially change your mind. And so, fantastic job, Dr. Heinz. Again, to the audience, I've got your website, Dr. Heinz, here in the live chat and the description box. If you exit out of your PowerPoint, Heinz, you should be able to make your way back to the studio where you can
Okay.
see. There we go. Okay, good to see you again.
Yeah.
Excellent job. Well, I've got a lot of notes and we got some questions from the audience based on many of the points that you made. The points you made initially on design and near the end, the impossibility of abiogenesis, naturalistic origin of life. Excellent points, irrefutable. Naturalists really have no good explanation for those facts. So early on in your presentation and throughout, you did a great job dismantling evolution. Now, a major challenge that proponents of evolution will advance to us as creationists, Dr. Heinz, is this. They'll say, okay, you're attacking evolution. You're saying that evolution does not fit the empirical scientific data. But they'll actually accuse us, Heinz, of being hyper evolutionists. They'll say, well, you guys believe in a flood, which we do. The evidence powerfully supports 4,500 years ago, where you have roughly 2 of every kind brought onto the ark. You have this massive bottleneck of all animals on the planet. And the earth restarts with what I like to call ark archetypes. And so you might have a Felid archetype, you might have Canid archetype, and representative of all the different species today. And so the evolutionists will say all within that time period, just a few thousand years, from those ark animals, right, Dr. Heinz, you have to get all of the species, both extinct species, let's say during the Ice Age, and also today. And so how do you like to respond to that accusation that because of the variation that we have to explain after the flood, Dr. Heinz, that we as creationists, we are evolutionists. Actually, they'll say that we believe in more evolution than them because they at least explain all the variation over millions of years, whereas we have to explain it in just a few thousand years. What's a good response to that?
Well, scientists have looked at that, Christian scientists, and there are books written on that. There's the Ark, as described in the Bible, and there's a replica of that in Kentucky, as some of you may know. And we don't have to bring every species, they didn't have to bring every species onto the Ark because there is variation in the living organisms that develop after they come up and after they get isolated in different parts of the earth. And some people would say, well, there's not enough room on the Ark to fit all the ones, the basic kinds that are mentioned in the Bible. And there are people who have studied that in detail, and I'm not one of them, but there are books which explain how that could happen. And I would point people to answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries International. They have articles on that very topic. I'm not an expert on that, but I know there's many articles on that topic.
Heinz, I appreciate that response. Though typically follow up by and more informed evolutionists, they'll point to ancient civilizations like Egypt, for example. And they'll say, well, let's assume Egypt is roughly 1,000 years or so after the flood. Perhaps you can touch on that, the rekindling of civilization after the flood and how that looks in a biblical model. And they'll say, we have representatives of extant felids, let's say, domestic cats, tigers, lions in some civilizations. And so they'll say, well, since this is only 1,000 years roughly after the flood, you have to explain as creationists how did all of those extant variations come about so rapidly? Is it possible, Dr. Heinz, from a creationist model, to explain those species coming about so quickly after the flood?
Yeah. Well, the time of the flood is roughly 4,500 years ago, plus or minus. And in the Genesis, in the chapter 10 and 11 there, it's explained all the different groups of people that came from Noah's family over time. And when God made them disperse over the earth, they went through different corners of the earth, and that would be true of the animals as well. And so you mentioned the Egyptian culture. Some people say, well, the Egyptian culture seems to have started earlier than the time of Noah's flood. But actually, that turns out not to be true. There are books written on that topic as well. In fact, we have some people that speak at the Apologetics Forum, which cover that, which shows that the biblical timeline and the Egyptian timeline, they do match with each other if you identify the correct pharaoh at the time of Joseph. When he was the ruler of second ruler in Egypt there. So yes, they do come together there, and yes, we do have different. I mean, the cat kind, there are many different actual animals in the cat kind, and they can form very quickly when they get dispersed and all that. Again, I can't go into a whole lot of detail on that, but there are books written on that, how that can happen.
I like to point out that when it comes to, let's say, a Felid archetype off of the ark, and within 1,000 years or so in Egypt, we have representation of leopards, lions, domesticated cats. Okay. Very simply, the creation model, we believe in design diversity. Not all DNA differences are the result of mutations over time. That's how the evolutionists argue, right, Dr. Heinz? There's two very different starting points. Evolutionists believe that all or nearly all DNA variety is due to mutations. We would actually argue that the vast majority of DNA differences or DNA variety in technical terms is a result of created heterozygosity, that animals were created in a state of DNA diversity. Okay, so off of the ark, you have a cat archetype or a dog archetype, a bear archetype. All those DNA differences are front loaded. We don't have to explain new variations, novel phenotypic diversity, let's say, through mutations over time. So due to the environmental shifts after the flood, as you said, breakaway populations, mechanisms of speciation, you can get these new species rather quickly, actually, because here's the important point that I like to point out to the evolutionists. We're just looking at morphological variation. Isn't that right, Heinz? From an archetype, it's just morphological variation. We're not looking at true anatomical novelty. I mean, the evolutionists have to explain new body plans. They have to explain eyes, brains, circulatory system, the heart, so on and so forth. But if you just look at the differences between, let's say, domestic cats, lions, tigers, leopards, jaguars, it's all just basic morphological variation, isn't it, Dr. Heinz?
Yes, it is. I mean, all the information for the cat kind is there, so you can have a variety, as they go to different parts of the earth or some other environmental constraints. But it's all there to start. So cats can, in fact, I'm sure you know about cats and lions. There are some species that can reproduce, and they can produce what is it called? I forget the term, but a tiger and a lion, for example, they produce ligar, and so so they belong to the same original species, or sorry, not species, but the original kind. And the kind is more like a family at the family level. Okay, and so there's a lot of information in those original living organisms, and that comes out into different species later on.
Well, I think you made an important point in your presentation, that it's the sorting of genetic variability. When we get all these variations, nothing is really being added that's meaningful. We have an example with all your domesticated dogs. Basically, from 2 wolves, you can get all these domestic dogs, from Chihuahuas to Great Danes to Huskies, but it's actually the sorting out of pre-existing variability. And as a matter of fact, it's a loss in many cases of that pre-existing variability, where with 2 wolves, the information could be said to be built in, where eventually you'd get Chihuahuas. But with 2 Chihuahuas, so much of that variability or information has been lost that you're never going to get back to a wolf. And so, yeah, as creationists, we can look back to the Ark event, Dr. Heinz, and then also the creation event, and we can see the expansion of genetic information or variability. Evolutionists, it's an opposite view. They look back billions of years ago, as you laid out in your outline. They look back essentially to the contraction of genetic information, to a single-celled like ancestor that they have to say evolved into a multi-celled ancestor of fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal, monkey, man. And so that's going to require a lot of novelty. But what we see from the creation model, it's just the sorting out, as you've said, of pre-existing genetic information.
Right.
That's not hyper-evolution. So I think it's a straw man. I think it's inappropriate accusation to call us creationists hyper-evolutionists.
Well, the difference again, just to summarize, is that the kinds created at the time of creation had all the information for each of the kinds that it could develop into the different species later on. But with evolution, you don't have all the information in the beginning living organisms. How do you add new information if you believe this, that all living beings came from one living cell? How do you get the variety? You need more information, genetic information, and you have no source for getting that. You can only select from what's already there.
That's right. You nailed it there. Front-loaded genetic variability explains what we see. Critic in the chat says humans didn't evolve from monkeys, Donnie. No, according to the evolutionary model, you have humans and chimps, which are said to be great apes, and they can be traced back to a common ape-like ancestor. But if you go back even further than that, you'd have early primates or monkeys prior to great apes. And so that would be your series. As a matter of fact, it's interesting, Dr. Heinz, militant evolutionists like P.Z. Myers, for example, they've actually asserted that we're still fish, because that's their series, isn't it? Fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, within the mammals category, early primates, and then eventually humans. And so, yeah, I mean, according to the evolutionary model, they a lot of them believe they're still fish in many ways. But I just wanted to clear that up. If there's anything you'd like to add to that, Heinz, feel free to do so, and then I'll move to the next point.
Well, remember the Haeckel's embryos that the German scientists presented and said we go through different stages. As we go from a living cell, it goes through the fish stage and the reptile stage and all the different stages. But that in reality, that was fake. That was not real. So, and the evolutionists, the big thing that they have to explain is whatever the first living cell was in their world, how did that form? You can't form that by random chance processes, and you don't have enough information for all the species that we have today. Right. It's got to come from somewhere. And we believe all that information necessary for the different kinds was put there from the beginning.
You nailed it. Very important point. I think that could make a good clip, because that is an assertion or challenge frequently put forth, Dr. Heinz. I'm glad we dealt with it. So the next point in my notes, you discussed a lot of genetic entropy. One of my favorite books as well. I have it in my library behind me, Dr. John Sanford. He's been a blessing. And for those in the audience, in a nutshell, genetic entropy or genetic degeneration is simply, there we go.
Yeah.
Excellent book. It's the reality that most mutations are nearly neutral, slightly deleterious. Selection can't see them. Selection is limited. I like to say selection is basically a fine-tuning mechanism that keeps a species as strong as it can be. It's not adding anything new, but it's limited. It can't see these nearly neutral, slightly deleterious mutations as they build up over time, spread through genetic drift, and result in genetic degeneration. Doke, I appreciate that. There's the 4th edition. So what I'd like to ask you, Heinz, is typically the response from the evolutionists is this. They'll say, well, true beneficial mutations, they can counterbalance the damage. And so we've had many debates here. We recently had a debate between a population geneticist and Dr. Jerry Bergman, actually. Excellent debate, very technical. It was a privilege to moderate that. And so we got into these details. And informed evolutionists will say, okay, the vast majority of mutations are deleterious. They'll agree with that. But the small amount of beneficials that pop up, they'll say are enough to counterbalance the damage and drive adaptive evolution. So yes, most are deleterious, but just the few that come about that are truly beneficial, they're enough to counterbalance the damage to keep evolution going. If an evolutionist were to say that to you, Dr. Heinz, let's say in a discussion, what do you think the best way to respond is?
I think the best way to look at that is what happens if a beneficial mutation occurs in this living organism in the next generation, and then you have to preserve that beneficial. The beneficial mutation has to be able to replicate to the next generation. So, I mean, yes, you can get a beneficial mutation, but if it's not duplicated in every subsequent generation, it's just going to go away, and the probability of it building on itself is just so small. So because most mutations turn out, unfortunately, to be bad mutations, and the ones that are good, they still have to replicate from one generation to the next generation.
Yeah, the big
and all and nothing else breaks while you're doing that. It's
right. Those beneficial mutations need to also spread through the population, become dominant or more prevalent, even reach fixation to really cause any, I think, serious counterbalance. Dr. Heinz, I just wanted to ask you, is your laptop dying? Or I heard a noise a couple times and you were kind of lagging out there just a little bit on your, I wanted to make sure it was plugged in and you were still good.
Yep, I'm good.
Okay. Just double checking. I think you just froze up temporarily, but we're good. And so typically when creationists say that there are no true information adding mutations, Dr. Heinz, they'll point out a couple of their favorite examples. And one that's nearly always pointed out as an example of something that could counterbalance the damage, that could resolve the genetic entropy problem, is the nylon digesting bacteria. And I'm curious as to your thoughts on it. They'll say, well, we have these bacteria that have evolved the ability to now digest nylon, whereas they weren't able to do that prior. And so that novel mechanism must be new information. And those are the kinds of beneficials that pop up now and again that can drive adaptive evolution. Dr. Heinz, any thoughts on that one?
Well, explain again which organism are you referring to?
So it's bacteria, and apparently
Right.
they evolved the ability to digest nylon through mutations and
Sure.
selection.
Yeah, and that can happen, but what good does it do, that bacteria? It's going to change its characteristics somewhat, but it doesn't give any other beneficial benefits that I could think of. I mean, it's where's it going with that?
Yeah.
It's yeah,
Well, I think it goes back to what you're saying with Lee Spetner as well, the non-random evolutionary change model, because I've read articles that suggest that these enzymes were pre-existing. And the key was that the bacteria already had similar enzymes capable of breaking down substances that are very similar chemically to nylon. And so whereas some evolutionists will assert that this is novel information, evolutionary change in action, it actually might fit better in the model that you were putting forth in your presentation that Dr. Lee Spetner talks about. These are non-random evolutionary changes in response to environments. That
right.
those enzymes are there, and now they're altered slightly due to the stimuli, I guess you could say. And
Right.
so, is that really novel information, Heinz?
No, because it could be built into the organism, the information and how to deal with that, and it could keep on replicating that way, but where does it go? I mean,
Right.
it's still a bacteria.
That's right. Well, and they believe single-celled like ancestors over time, indirectly, slowly, through mutation, selection, epigenetics, gene flow, so on and so forth, genetic drift, of course, evolved into humans, chimpanzees, whales, strawberries. And so these basic adaptive changes like nylon digesting bacteria or sickle cell anemia. Well, it's interesting because a lot of them, maybe you can speak to this, Heinz. Even I'm not sure about the nylon digestion one. I'm not sure something's breaking down. That could be just true adaptation based on pre-existing information or variability to do so. But a lot of the other ones, like sickle cell anemia, from my understanding, you have an advantage. Those with both alleles of the sickle cell are resistant to malaria. But actually, when you look under the hood, look at the details, it's due to a deformed hemoglobin protein. So it's still broken information, isn't it, Heinz?
Right. Yeah, and I mean that once a certain capability is inherited, yes, it could keep going for a while, but these are not good things that are happening typically. I mean, you're losing information. I mean, when they say about, well, these other pieces could exist, but remember, life has to start as from one living cell in the evolution.
Right.
And where did that come from? I mean, nothing. We can show there's no way for that to happen by natural processes.
I like to break down this technical stuff into understandable analogies. An analogy I like to use, because Lenski's E. coli experiment, the so-called one of the best long-term evolutionary experiments the evolutionists assert, there were some adaptations observed, but after generations and generations of these E. coli bacteria, Heinz, apparently they've actually shrunk in functional genome size.
Yeah.
They've thrown out a lot of pre-existing genes. They're backed into a corner. They're handicapped. And so there's been, one could say a linear increase in fitness, but in terms of total functionality, they're going downhill. And it's similar to if we wanted temporarily better gas mileage in our car, okay, we could remove weight from the car, right? We could maybe start removing the interior seating or, the mirrors or the side mirrors, basically remove weight. And temporarily we get that benefit of better gas mileage, but it's at the expense of what? Breaking down the car, destroying. It's not explaining how the car got built up. And it seems like a lot of these so-called beneficials are due to exactly that, the breaking down of pre-existing systems for short-term adaptive purposes.
Yeah. Well, you think of the peppered moth.
Hmm.
I mean, that's the same kind of thing. I mean, people, the peppered moth during the early days before the industrial age. I mean, if they're um, white, uh, they're going to be found on a dark tree, and so predators could find them. But when you got into the industrial age, and things changed, and so the white moth really stands out against that dark background more, and so you're gonna lose them, and then the dark ones would predominate.
Right. It
So
stretches the imagination to believe that these types of beneficials that we're even discussing, the best that they could have to offer, are enough to believe that fish evolved into fishermen, that goo evolved into you. We would need something a little more impressive, I think, than basic adaptations or changes due to the breaking down of pre-existing systems, Heinz.
yeah, well, you think about the difference in the living organism. If a reptile were to evolve into a bird, I mean, birds have bones that are hollow and light, and the reptiles certainly don't have that. And a lot of things need to change for that to happen. And that's not going to happen in a random chance process, evolutionary process.
Yeah, they love to say that, well, dinosaurs evolved into birds. And since some dinosaurs had hollow bones that contained internal air sacs, that bypasses that evolutionary change. Ever heard that, Heinz?
Oh yeah, yeah, but it just doesn't work. And where are the fossils like the Archaeopteryx? I mean, that has been accepted as a bird by most, even evolutionists. And finding the one example, of the right fossil which proves evolution, you always have to ask, is um, the whole fossil there for that organism? Like with Lucy, we had bones, but we didn't know how they all fit together. So those that believe in evolution will say, well, if evolution is true, the bones must have fit this way. I mean, how do you put them together?
That's a good transition into my next set of notes on transitional fossils that you talked about. So a lot of good points there. What are your thoughts then, Heinz, on some of these so-called transitionals like Archaeopteryx, where they'll say, well, we find a blending of bird-like features and reptile-like features. For example, at the top of my head, you got the teeth, you've got the longer, more reptile-like tail. Then you've also got the feathers and the wings. And so to them, that is a good example of an intermediate because they comprise intermediate features, reptile and bird features.
But the problem is you don't find a whole bunch of samples of that. They work on one or two examples and say, oh, that must have been a transition. But what about that? You'd expect to find many more fossils that are in between different kinds of living organisms, and we're just not finding that worldwide.
A common reply from evolutionists on that is they'll point to what's called therapsids in the fossil record, or mammal-like reptiles. They'll say, well, we actually have a large collection of these mammal-like reptile creatures, Heinz, that actually blend the features of mammal characteristics and reptile traits. And they'll say there's a meeting of the intermediate criteria, and we've got a large collection of those creatures. And so they basically challenge creationists. Well, how do you, if we're going to say there's no example of transitional forms, how do we address mammal-like reptiles? What are your thoughts, Heinz?
Well, I would look at the environment where they were found, for one thing. Like Lucy, they found bones at different places and somehow, put them together. But they assume that evolution happened, And the same thing for these other ones that you're mentioning here. Do they all occur in the same place? Are they found in different parts of the world? Like we have, we have bone yards, if you will, where a lot of fossil bones are in one place.
Yeah, I like to personally respond to these points from mammal-like reptiles, Archaeopteryx, Tiktaalik, the so-called famous fishapod. These are just interesting mosaics.
Yeah.
Even man has designed in the world of human engineering, Heinz, interesting, so-called intermediates like the crossover SUV that blends the features of an SUV and a van. Or the military, amazingly, they designed what's called the military amphibious assault vehicle, which blends features of a military ship and a military tank. Okay, that's a nice designed intermediate, quote unquote, or mosaic. And so I think that's what we see in the fossil record are interesting mosaics. But if evolution were true, large scale evolution, then we shouldn't just be arguing over a few favorite examples, right? They should have tens of thousands of examples where there's really just no debate. We find a few interesting candidates, right, Heinz? But to me, those are just interesting mosaics that God designed.
Yeah. And well, of course, your analogy to the military vehicle, well, they were designed, right? They didn't happen through natural processes. So it's not really an analogy that means much. And for if there were to be transitions between different families, for example, you'd expect to find a whole spectrum in between those two different families of living organisms.
Right. Well, these mosaics are design combinations for specific purposes, like we see in the man-made design world, and then like we also see in the biological world. And it's funny because they'll say, like there's a critic in the chat, oh, you can't use those kinds of comparisons because cars don't reproduce. To me, that's a very, very desperate follow-up. Adding reproduction actually complicates the issue more for evolutionists. That's more complexity, more sophistication. Imagine man could design their vehicles to self-replicate. They'd be making billions of dollars. They'd save a ton of money on workers. But that's the limitations of man.
Yeah.
God, he's so much more complex and infinite that he can actually design the biological world, not only in homologous patterns, in nested hierarchical patterns, and these interesting mosaics. He also designed creatures to be able to what, Heinz? Reproduce.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, it brings up an interesting point. I'm actually going to do another talk on, I call it God's incredible creatures. Okay, and so if you look at the giraffe, for example, what could it possibly have evolved from? There's no animal like it in the world that is anywhere close to it. So, how do you explain that in terms of evolution?
Right. Well, just like a lot of these chicken and egg problems you were talking about in your presentation, DNA, RNA, proteins. One of my favorite mutually interdependent systems is DNA repair enzymes in DNA, Dr. Heinz, because it has been said in a single day, a single cell, and we got 60 trillion of them, could experience up to 1 million DNA breaks. Well, thank God we have these amazingly designed DNA repair enzymes that go in and fix a lot of those breaks.
Right.
Problem for the naturalists in the chat, answer this. How do you explain this chicken and egg problem? What came first? Because it turns out that the information for the DNA repair enzymes, Heinz, are encoded in the DNA. And you need the DNA repair enzymes for the DNA to survive, to fix a lot of those breaks. What came first, DNA or DNA repair enzymes?
Yeah. Sometimes when I talk about the origin of life, I like to give the example of the birth of a baby. The baby starts out as one cell. The the sperm and the egg get together and form that one cell. And then it duplicates and it produces cells that are identical, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. And then all of a sudden they start to differentiate into different kinds of body cells that we have. Humans have about 200 different kinds of cells in our bodies. So what controls when it starts to differentiate? If it starts to differentiate at the wrong time, you're not going to get your end product. It has to be a very exact program that controls the duplication and the diversity of the cells in our body.
Oh, wow, that's an amazing point. The arguments you put forth for design, for these chicken and egg problems, the first and second law of thermodynamics. I mean, these are realities, scientific realities that any objective thinking person should look at and give the glory to God, Dr. Heinz.
Yeah. We are very complex. We as human beings are we're one of the most complex. We're made up of think of it, 2 arms. How did that happen by chance? And two ears and 2 eyes, right? Fortunately, he only gave us 1 mouth, so we should listen more than we talk.
That's a great point. That is some great advice right there. And to those in the chat, we appreciate the criticisms, but again, the comments that come in saying, "Oh, cars don't reproduce." To me, all that is rhetoric. It's not an actual argument. Analogies are meant for what, Heinz? To illustrate reasoning patterns, not be literal equivalents. And so comparing the biological world to, let's say, modes of transportation, what that is showing is that shared design features don't require common ancestry. We as humans design in homologous patterns. Why shouldn't God? And this brings me to my next question, Heinz, because militant proponents of evolution, they'll say, okay, if common descent isn't true, why are humans more similar? Why do we share more in terms of morphology, anatomy, and genetics with a chimpanzee than we do with a monkey or a fish or a banana plant? They call that a nested hierarchy. And they'll say, well, the reason is because we share a more recent common ancestor with the chimpanzee than we do with a monkey, a fish, or a banana plant. And so they say that meets evolutionary expectations. Heinz, what's a good way to respond to
that? Yeah, well, there's a lot of assumptions made built into that. Yes, we have common DNA with the chimp. But remember, it started out that we had 99% of our DNA was similar, but now we know that it's maybe 85% is similar to that of a chimp, and part of it is we both have arms, we both have legs, and there's only so many ways you can build it. Our legs are different from the chimp's legs, and our arms are different. Where our eyes are and the skull are different from a chimp, and but still the basics is there. So it used to be that homologous was an argument for evolution, but it's also design can explain that. There's only so many ways to design eyes, only so many ways to design fingers and toes and all that. They have to be flexible.
So based on your response then, is it the reason why we're therefore more genetically similar to a chimpanzee? Because even if we go with the 85% or the 96% number, we're still most similar to chimps genetically in the animal kingdom. And so the evolutionists will say, well, we still have our point. We still have a nested hierarchy. So the reason why we share more in terms of genetics with chimpanzees than, let's say, with a rhino or a horse, or even a lemur, let's say, something that evolutionists would say are closer? Is that because we look more similar? We look more similar to the chimp, meaning we're going to require more shared DNA, Heinz?
Yeah, well, of course, I was not the designer of the chimp, so I'm not sure how to explain that, but we're different enough. Remember, our bodies, we are losing information, and we are mutating, naturally. But even, we have so many base pairs in our bodies, and if just 15% is different, but the difference in the genes, somebody has calculated that it would take, at the rate that we are mutating in our bodies, at the rate that the chimp is mutating in its body, if a chimp were to have to become like the human, there's not enough time, even in billions, trillions of years, not enough time to get there at the rate that the mutations. So that shows you the connection is just, it's wishful thinking.
That's a great point. The waiting time problem. Evolutionists will typically respond by saying, well, if we go with the same methodology that some scientists use to get the 85% number, applied consistently across the animal kingdom, Dr. Heinz, that same methodology puts gorillas, because we as creationists would say all gorillas go back to most likely a gorilla ancestor on the ark. That same methodology makes certain gorilla variations or species 15% different as well. And so they'll say, well, why is that an argument? If you creationists believe that gorillas, if they're related, can be 15% different, why can't humans and chimps be 15% different?
Mm-hmm. Well, the other thing is that, there is that 15% difference, and to bridge that, calculate how much time it would take at the rate our genome is mutating. There's not enough time to get there. I mean, that's the basic argument. And why, if we had mutated from some ape-like creature, where are the ones that are in between us? It's been said that, chimp is probably the most similar to the human, but where are the ones in between? We don't see them.
Would you say that all gorillas are related, Heinz?
Well, I don't know for certain. I mean, how do you define the gorilla? I mean, how many chromosomes and all that? You have to look at that. I mean,
yeah, because I would say that because all gorillas can interbreed, they all have 48 chromosomes, that they're all related and go back to an archetype. It also turns out that when you look at the Y chromosome, Heinz, between humans, chimps, and gorillas, it's fascinating. It's really bad for evolutionists because the Y chromosome, which is uniparentally, paternally inherited DNA, is less than 30% the same when you consider overall size differences, gene content, and architecture. And it turns out, this is a break in their hierarchy, the gorilla Y and the human Y are more similar to each other than either is to the chimpanzee Y. And so it sounds like we're looking at several different kinds there. Humans, chimps, and bonobos, I would say, are their own kind, go back to a common ancestor, and then you have gorillas. But this is the evolutionist challenge. If we as creationists are going to say that gorillas are related, but yet they're also 15% different, then why is there a waiting time problem for the evolutionists, but not for us? Does that make sense, Heinz?
Well, still, the reality is today, we are that 15% difference, and we can't bridge that gap. And there's nobody in between, us and the chimp, or us and the gorilla, right? You can't bridge that difference in any time.
But what about the gorillas? If we're saying as creationists all gorillas are related, yet they have a 15% difference, don't we as creationists have to account for why gorillas are 15% different?
Well, gorillas are probably not 15% different from each other.
No, that's what I'm saying. If we use the same methodology that gets humans and chimps 15% different, that same methodology gets gorillas within themselves 15% different.
Well, I don't think that follows. I mean, if there are gorillas that are very similar, different species, but still very similar, that's not going to be that much different. I don't know the numbers that have been measured for them, whether those genomes are totally mapped or not.
Yeah, that's what they're saying. Some creationists as well are more comfortable with the 96% number because it's a different methodology, and that makes gorillas very similar as well. But if you use the methodology that gets the 85%, it makes humans within themselves a lot different, makes gorillas a lot different. And so I'm just basically reiterating how critics might respond. And typically they'll just say it's inconsistent. But okay, I was curious to see your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Dr. Heinz. Okay, so the next question I had for you as we start to kind of wind down here has to do with Lucy. And so critics will say, okay, Lucy was only 40% the same, but because of bilateral symmetry, 40% is a lot, because if we have most of, let's say, the right side, you'll have a good idea what the left side looks like. Let's say you had just the right side of my pelvis.
Mm-hmm.
You could extrapolate that consistently to know to a pretty good degree what the left side also looks like. So they'll say, sure, although it's 40%, we have a really good idea what Lucy looked like because we can just extrapolate what the left side looks like. Yeah. What's a good response to that, Heinz?
Yeah. Well, it's the 40% is the percentage of bones that they found, of all the bones necessary to make up that organism. And so you could try to do that, but how do you know the bones that you picked are on the left side or on the right side? And the feet, well, there are no feet found in that there. The leg bones, I don't know if you can tell the difference that much between whether it was the left foot or the right foot. And same with all, the ribs, and because they're not complete bones, they were put together. Somebody showed a bag of bones. It was so small actually, and but how do you put them together? You can assume that that you have the complete. Well, not complete. You have 40% of something, but you don't know whether all those pieces came from the same living organism.
Right. Good point. Yeah, because even some paleoanthropologists, they've admitted with certain so-called transitional homins like Australopithecus sediba might be a mixture of both human or homo, which they might mean something different than what we would mean, maybe Homo habilis, and Australopithecine ape bones. So even the evolutionary community acknowledges that the reality is there that some bones could be mixed together.
Right.
I think that's a good point you make.
Yeah, you have to make assumptions. And of course, you're going to make assumptions that support your theory.
Yeah, I'm looking at comments in the chat here to keep up. And their response is using comparative anatomy to compare to other so-called Australopithecine specimens. And so, for example, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, Dr. Heinz, but a lot of evolutionists now, they'll take the reconstructed pelvis of Lucy, as some have said that it was reconstructed erroneously. A hacksaw was taken to it, and it was made to be more ape-like. But they'll say now we have more specimens. And so I'm curious how we as creationists should respond to this. This is Lucy, AL288-1. But they'll look to other so-called Australopithecines. Here's a famous one, STW 573. That's Littlefoot, which they argue is very complete, articulated. The skull is connected to the rest of the body, the postcranial material. And they'll say that the pelvis is largely intact, as you can see here. And it actually matches to that of the Lucy reconstructed pelvis. And so now they're saying, okay, based on new data and new fossil finds, Lucy's reconstructed pelvis is accurate, because now we have more complete pelvises from other so-called Australopithecines, and they match the reconstructed one.
Yeah. Yeah, I have not seen this one here. That is much more complete than Lucy, obviously, but I'm not sure where all the parts came from. Does it have a complete foot on there?
It has a lot of the foot, but I think it is missing some of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. There are people like Dr. Carl Werner. Yeah,
Yes.
he's really analyzed this in a lot of depth. So he would be familiar with that. I've not seen that, so I don't want to express opinions based on that.
Yeah, he's done an excellent job. We did a 3-part series exposing evolutionary frauds, and then also an episode on living fossils. Some really good data.
Yeah.
And so even if the Australopithecines had a pelvis, in light of all the other pelvises, that was more similar to, let's say, humans than they were to a chimpanzee today,
Yeah.
would that be an issue for creationists?
Yeah, that's a kind of a hypothetical question, because unless you see what they have and where it all came from, and did that come from exactly the same area, and how many of those bones did they have to, they found different places, but they put them together the way they thought they should be. I mean, you've got to have all the facts to make an opinion on that, I think.
I guess they would point to the nearly complete example of Littlefoot, STW 573.
Yeah.
And they say, well, we got the pelvis there that looks very similar to human pelvis today, and the reconstructed Lucy pelvis. And so if what they're saying is correct, then would that be an issue to creationists, or would that just be variation in an extinct primate-like kind?
And they believe that the pelvis was a human pelvis, or?
Oh, they believe it was a transitional pelvis, like they believe Lucy's pelvis was. So they believe that these Australopithecines are extinct transitional forms, basically, that bridge that gap from non-human apes to humans.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I wouldn't want to express an opinion on that without knowing more facts. I think that's dangerous.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I've examined those pelvises, and they've even admitted, especially in Lucy's pelvis, that the design of it actually would not have allowed it to support its weight like modern humans today. I've got a quote from paleoanthropologists on that. And so even if it was slightly more similar to humans than it is to chimpanzees, it was still different enough where at best your Australopithecines would have been optional bipedal and not habitual bipeds like we are today. And so the point is, there does seem to be enough gaps still to challenge the evolutionary interpretation of them.
Yeah. And if I'm assuming they just found one like that.
Yeah, they've got a few they'd point to. Africanus, they'd look to Sediba, Littlefoot. So there's a few specimens they'd look to, but I don't think any of them pose us a challenge. The Littlefoot one's interesting because, as you can see, it's quite complete. But again, enough differences still in the pelvis to separate us from the Australopithecines.
Yeah.
If what they're saying is accurate on it.
Yeah. And again, you need to be aware of, evolutionists are going to be making assumptions that support their view. So you got to be very, very careful of that. And of course, as creationists too, we need to be concerned about that.
Right. I have a critic here, paleoanthropologist in the chat. Doc, appreciate it. He's looking for the quote that I just brought up. So it's right here. You can look at it. Looks like it might be from 2012. Here's the source, Reconstructing Human Origins. The cross-sectional area of Lucy's lower back vertebra, particularly the lumbar and sacral vertebra, are also extraordinarily small, suggesting that they were not adapted for the bearing of heavy loads associated with fully upright postures. So point is, to the evolutionists in the chat asking that question, even if the interpretation of what evolutionists are saying is true on the pelvies of Australopithecines, there's still some major differences that separate them from us as humans. And I would say those differences, those gaps, are challenges to evolutionists. So there it is, if you want to save that, Doc, and he can have a look at that.
Okay.
Well, Dr. Heinz, I got to say, I'm looking at my notes, and we essentially touched on everything that you covered, which was a lot. It was a 90-minute presentation, and I wanted to be as comprehensive as possible. We touched on, let me see here, the hyperevolution, the beneficial mutations, the transitional fossils, the homology, nested hierarchies, Lucy, and then we touched a little bit on design and chicken and egg problems. Wow. Okay, this was thorough, Dr. Heinz Lycklama. This was excellent. I had a ton of fun. I enjoy these rigorous discussions personally, kind of digging deep and brainstorming and looking at the best challenges they have to offer. So I really enjoy, I really appreciate your work and time. And what I wanted to do, Heinz, is hand it to you in case you had anything you wanted to leave us with, myself and also the audience, in terms of final words, brother.
Sure. Well, one thing that I feel I didn't cover well enough, I've got a lot more information on that, is, everything depends on the origin of first life, right? And I say there are four things which show that first life cannot happen by chance. The first one is the law of biogenesis, which says that life only comes from life. Okay, and that law has never been falsified. The other thing is, the second thing is the search for first life through abiogenesis. Spontaneous generation, we agree, doesn't happen. But scientists trying to find other ways that life could have originated, from non-life. And every experiment that has been done and is being done has failed miserably, including, the original Miller experiment in 1953. Even he agrees that doesn't come close to explaining first life. And I mentioned the law of mathematical probability. What's the mathematical probability of everything that's necessary for a first simple living organism that can self-replicate coming to be? All the pieces need to be there. The mathematical probability is so small that it just is not going to happen. And the fourth thing, the reason why we don't have first life from random chance processes is the fact that the only difference between life and non-life is information. And information doesn't come about through random chance processes. Information only comes through some intelligent agent. And so for even to talk about evolution, you need to have first life. And we can't get there through natural processes. I've got to talk on who is the author of life, God or natural processes. And given those four avenues, they all point to an intelligent designer who we believe is God, the God of the Bible. And so evolutionists need to consider that. They want to overlook that. But if you can't get the first life, you've got nothing to evolve. So that is, I sometimes call that a stopper. It stops any discussion on evolution because you can't get there without first life. And so evolutionists have to explain that. And I mean, there's a lot. I mean, a lot of other people working in this area that have produced good material that we have access to. And I've shown you 6 different books. There are more, and I haven't read all of those 6 books, but there's very useful information in there. I've got a list of all those books, on my PowerPoint slides, which I believe you will have a way of downloading if you want to do that. So again, thank you for the opportunity, and we look forward to having interesting discussions on that and other related topics. Thank you.
Amen. Great final words. You're an encyclopedia worth of information, Dr. Heinz. Doki Doki, one of our mods in the chat, says that's quite a treasure trove of books behind Heinz. Yes. And many excellent book recommendations. I would personally love a copy of your PowerPoint presentation. I thought it was fantastic and very well researched, but comprehensive. You touched on a number of really good topics and offered a lot of really good resources. So what you said there is great. I just have to point it out that the evolutionists, they don't really have a strong model because they can't even start the race. They haven't even begun the race because they have no good explanation for the origin of life, which tells me that what we've been discussing, what you presented, Heinz, on front-loaded genetic information or design diversity, that the information for all these variations and adaptations that we see was designed by God in the beginning, that makes the most sense of the data. We don't have an abiogenesis problem. We don't have a problem explaining the origin of novel genetic complexity and so on and so forth. So Heinz, you did a great job. Those were some excellent final words. And I look forward to hopefully joining you again for a presentation in the future. So Heinz, God bless you. To the audience, thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate all of the feedback, the comments, the challenges, the objections. We had a good mix tonight of critics and non-critics. And I enjoyed the rigorous discussion. I enjoyed the challenges that you brought forth that allowed Heinz and I to dig a little deeper on these issues. And in many ways, model build, show you guys that the creation model, I think, has the best explanations for the evidence that we see around us. And so, Dr. Heinz, thanks again to the audience. I hope you had as much fun as I did. God bless you all. Standing for Truth is signing off.